talk is called Suffering is Optional. And by that term, I don't mean that suffering ends and you may never suffer again in your whole life. That's not the perspective here. But what I do mean is that in any moment, it's possible not to suffer. And the way to do that is to realize that if you're triggered in a certain moment, if a pattern has taken hold, some kind of conditioning, you have an emotional reaction of some kind, it's possible to bring care and love and understanding to your experience in that moment to find your way out of that conditioning. Our true nature is consciousness. We've been hearing that all week. It's the absolute truth of reality. We are not what our thoughts tell us that we are. These thoughts mislead us into thinking that we're separate and that we're identified as something that's way less than what we actually are. So it's a mistaken identity when we believe what our thoughts tell us that we are. And because it's a mistaken identity, it's not the truth, that means that in every moment it's possible to know what the truth actually is. And in my experience and the experience of people I know and work with, the only way, the only true way to find our way out of suffering is to bring this non-dual understanding to these moments. Because if we're suffering, we're identified as separate, and we can find our way to this reality that who we are is not this separate self, that we are this undivided oneness that is the ground of being of everything. And that's possible when we bring our attention in toward our experience. So I'm going to be talking more. There's been a lot of talk about consciousness. I'm going to be talking more about what happens when we suffer. So yes, if you can quickly, and if it's very apparent for you, to find your way into just releasing thoughts and feelings and finding your way into conscious awareness and just doing that and living that peacefully and with your inner aliveness, that's great. But for many of us, we get caught, and I know I'm not alone, that we get triggered, we have feelings that arise, and we need to find our way out of that, because it is absolutely the truth that it's optional to suffer. We can find our way to this peace and ease that at the core of our being. So in the mid-90s, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the extent of human suffering, because it breaks our hearts. In the mid-90s, there was a study done in a large medical center in San Diego. There were some physicians who started thinking that they were seeing their patients not getting better in the way that they thought that they should. So they were interested in investigating, like, what is going on with these people? And they started wondering if there was something about early stressful life events that was inherent in them, that somehow lived in these patients as adults, that was somehow preventing their recovery and their full functioning in life. So this study was actually revolutionary and so it's really shed the light on what's going on. And what they came up with is 10 what they've been called adverse childhood experiences. So here they are. And you can take a look: abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then these other ones of mental illness in the family, incarcerated relative, substance abuse, mother treated violently, and divorce. When I first saw this diagram, I was blown away, because if you just take one of these and you feel into what that person's life is like on a day-to-day level when they experience, for example, an incarcerated relative, it's nice to kind of give that label, but what is that, let's say, child's experience of living in a family where there's an incarcerated relative? Very painful. So what was found in the study of these adverse childhood experiences is that in adulthood, the more of these, they're called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the more ACEs that a person has, the greater the likelihood of all kinds of outcomes. So more substance abuse, more likelihood of a suicide attempt, greater chance of heart disease, greater chance of cancer, diabetes, all these physical illnesses that people get, anxiety, just in general not functioning well in life in all of these specific ways. So when we, in childhood, experience difficult circumstances, this is how we develop conditioned patterns and begin to identify ourselves as separate and limited, and we forget the truth and the possibility to know that we are this vastness, this freedom. We can always, in any moment, find freedom from these conditioned patterns. So in knowing that, it begins to bring us into an understanding of what conditioned patterns are. And I want to tell you about a client that I've been working with, who I'll call Andrew, who grew up in a family. There wasn't a lot of abuse there, but there was an alcoholic father. And when he was a little kid, every single day when he came home from school, he had a relative in a house that he felt reasonably safe with. He never went home. So this is a little 8, 9, 10-year-old boy. Every single day, he was scared to go home. He had to go and be with his relative who was, okay, wasn't like the ideal parent, but at least she was like a safe presence for him. And wait until 9 o'clock at night till he thought it was safe to go home, because if he had gone home earlier, he would have seen the father raging and the mother trying to deal with the alcoholic father and all this chaos in the home. And these were like middle-class people, reasonably, functional in life, but this was this child's day-to-day experience. And as an adult now, he suffers depression. He's had his own problems with substance abuse. He's had relationship problems with divorces and physical illnesses as well. So the point that I want to get across here is how profound it is when we have these experiences in childhood that embed in our nervous systems and attach to our thought patterns and become our emotional reality. And when that happens, we have to figure out as kids how to deal with that. And then how can we possibly know the peace and happiness of our true nature? How do we know the freedom that's possible? The forgetting is so profound when these experiences are so strong in us. But it's not just these kind of specific traumas. Mark Epstein is a Buddhist writer who wrote a book with the title of The Trauma of Everyday Life. So even if you've had none of those ACEs, it's possible that, when you're not attuned to when you're a child, or are you, anything that can happen in a family, in those little ways, the kid is left crying in the crib wanting food when the mother's too busy or preoccupied. These little traumas, and trauma might be a strong word for that, but maybe not. Because what happens is the nervous system contracts, the muscles get contracted, and the emotions take over, and the peace and ease goes underground and becomes unavailable to us. And then if we take that into later childhood, we have messages that we've gotten from these experiences that we're not good enough, that we can't trust life, that we can't trust the world, that we can't trust ourselves. And we grow up with these beliefs. And these affect everything about adulthood, the choices we make for our careers, our partners, our relationships, the behavioral choices that we make, our day-to-day experience of emotions. Can anybody identify with this? Yeah, okay. No, okay. All right. But, that you're even here at SAND is an absolute miracle. If you are blessed, you find yourself at the feet of a teacher. You find yourself at a place like SAND, and you begin to know the possibility that this doesn't have to be your reality. And when I say it doesn't have to be your reality, I don't mean that in a black and white way, that in one day, the day before, your life is a mess and you're suffering, and then the next day there's some awakening and everything falls into place. It's not how it works. what happens is there has to be an unwinding of patterns. Whether you've had a big awakening experience or not, whether you know that profundity of your true nature, these patterns live in us, and it's possible to unwind them. So let's look a little bit at how to do that. So when I began working with Andrew, who I told you about, he had a long-standing problem with depression. We were talking about it, and I said, let's do an experiment. So I put a pillow on a chair opposite him, and I said, this is your depression. What would you like to say to it? And there was a long silence in the room as he stared at the pillow. And I could tell he was just trying to figure out what to do. And finally, he looked at me, he said, I can't do that. My depression is so much a part of me, I can't imagine it being elsewhere. I can't imagine it being out of me. I can't feel the gap between myself and my depression. So what that said to me is I need to go a little more slowly with him. So he couldn't find the gap in that moment, but the gap is there always. So if you feel anxious, you can observe that anxiety. If you feel, and the sensations that appear in your body, if you have a moment of feeling inadequate and having that overcome you, you can take a breath and bring your attention, and attention is so essential here, to work with your attention. You can bring it away from that thought pattern and observe it and see it, and that's the beginning of a profound change, and in the direction of knowing your true nature. So when we have these conditioned patterns, when they are our reality, we develop strategies to deal with them. And we talked about some of those yesterday in the experiential, and a lot of these are interpersonal strategies. So if you feel like your world isn't safe, you might go into people-pleasing, just making sure you're the perfect child or the perfect adult, and wanting to please everyone and making sure everyone else is happy and at ease and satisfied while you're abandoning yourself, really. So that kind of pattern leads to those coping strategies that work in a certain sense. Of course, we want to feel safe, and we want the people around us to be calm and safe so that we can feel better inside. But it's a strategy based on conditioning, and it's a lot of work, and it's stressful to keep carrying that out, and ultimately you'll find that it's not successful. So other strategies are seeking approval and attention, or withdrawing into ourselves. I worked with a client in a very stressful home who, when she did the least bit infraction, she would be sent to her room and her mother wouldn't talk to her for days. Her strategy was organizing her drawers over and over, taking the stuff out of the drawers, organizing them, putting the drawers back. A coping strategy that makes complete sense in the situation, but obviously brings so much suffering to her life. So we come up with these strategies and ways of coping that have a good intent, a beautiful intent, because we want to feel as good as possible in our lives, but they don't bring us happiness. And then we have emotions, and emotions go underground often. So if there's a conditioned pattern in place for you, if you're anxious about getting things done, or if you feel afraid that someone's going to reject you or abandon you, it could be any conditioned pattern, there are going to be emotions underneath, and these are unexplored emotions. But the fact that these are unexplored creates tremendous opportunity, because we could always bring our attention to our emotions to understand what's going on with them and how they live in our bodies. So part of the experience of emotions, in fact, the major part, is how they show up in our bodies. So when we have unexplored emotions, if you can imagine an infant in a crib screaming to be fed, really terrorized that this is a life and death situation as an infant, there's tremendous contraction in the body. And if that's not somehow dealt with by holding and attention and the opportunity to release it, this tension goes underground and it lives in our nervous systems and it lives in the cells of our body. And it will live there until it's given the opportunity for release. When I first began on this path, I was very much in my head and realized at one point how much fear was operating underneath. And I just was blown away because I was kind of rough and tough and I could do anything and kind of independent in the world. And then I started becoming sensitive to all this fear that was operating. And then I began to see how much it was living in my body. And then I would sit on the sofa for hours and hours, just letting sensations just come out into the light of awareness, and they come for liberation. So that's possible in any moment, to have a great connection with your body so that you can realize when there are emotions there. And when we get to bring those emotions out into awareness, out to be seen, we realize that there's really nothing there but sensation. And that's quite liberating. So let's talk a little bit about thoughts, because thought patterns are part of the problem, let's say, of identification as separate. If you identify yourself as separate in some way, as limited, you're believing some thought process about yourself. You're believing you're inadequate. You're believing you're never going to be enough. You're believing that the future is going to be scary and negative, and which creates all this worry and anxiety. So what do we do with thought patterns when they come? Because they will come. And this is the point, no matter where you are in your spiritual practice, in your spiritual path, these kinds of thoughts have a momentum behind them because they're so conditioned. And when we recognize, and this is the key, when we can recognize, this thought pattern is running right now, then there's the opportunity to realize that you don't have to believe the content of your thoughts. You don't have to believe the content of your thoughts. And I want you to not take my word for that, but begin the investigation and the inquiry in your own experience, that you don't have to believe what your thoughts tell you about yourself, about other people, and about the world and the past and the future. So when we bring our attention into our experience, we realize that we can lose interest in the content of thoughts. They run, blah, blah, blah. They just go and, tell you how bad you are and what you shouldn't be doing and how everything should be different and how the other guy shouldn't be doing what he's doing. That's what thoughts do, for the most part. Some of them are useful, but most of our thoughts are not useful, and they don't support our peace and happiness. So in any moment, you can take a breath and lose interest in the content of your thoughts. I want to say a couple words about, we talk a lot in these circles about welcoming and welcoming emotions. And when we welcome emotions, what that means is that we bring our attention into our experience, we turn ourselves inward toward ourselves, toward our inner experience. It might help to label the emotion, and then we go into the physical sensations that are there and just allow them to be. It's like a welcoming. It's like you're a friendly host to your experience. But sometimes in extreme trauma, even welcoming is way too much. So other strategies need to be used until welcoming is possible. So these are things like walking on the earth and using your senses. Oh, this is what I'm hearing. This is what I'm seeing. Feeling the wind on your skin. These are present-centered practices that bring your attention out of the thoughts and feelings of the trauma and into the present. But it may take time in extreme trauma before there's the possibility of looking directly into the emotions and the direct experience of what's here. So for people, this is often a process. And we go carefully and gently, and we bring love and understanding to our inner experience. So the message that I want to leave you with is that suffering is optional. And this is really important, not that you will never ever feel suffering again. That's the mind telling you like there's some goal that you should attain that is next to impossible. But in any moment you can bring your attention into your experience and see what's there and be curious and welcoming and loving and bring understanding to it. What is this thought? Not the content of it, but what is a thought? What is a feeling? What is a sensation? What is here in this moment? And then expanding your attention beyond these objects and realizing that there's this formless and timeless awareness that all of this arises in. So in any moment you can find that freedom. And you find it over and over and over, coming home every single time. Thank you so much.